Hello there, YouTube world. This is Sean with Rule Zero Podcast, and I was inspired to film sort of not necessarily a response, but more of an analysis and thoughts on the recent video that you might be seeing on your screen right now. Hopefully, if all is working well, looking in the mirror, a discussion with the professor from Josh Lee Kwai. This is in response to Josh being accused of victim blaming during a previous video, and I think it's safe to say there's an element of that he did. When he particularly asked, "What did you expect in terms of the rules committee banning a bunch of stuff?" And somehow they were, in his mind at the time, when he said this in anger, they were supposed to imagine a world where people sent death threats. And yeah, so that's victim blaming, right? I think it's fair to say that as a volunteer rules committee, or as any line of work period, you shouldn't receive death threats. You shouldn't receive any kind of threats because people are upset because of your work or your job, unless your work or your job is that you're an assassin of some sort. And then I guess these niche cases can come up where maybe then the response to you is, hostile. But that is not the rules committee. They are a friendly, genuinely seeming to love fun and care about the thing and do it all for free. And have been doing so for years, trying to act as stewards of a format that is enormous and wide and varied. But what I wanted to talk about in this sort of looking in the mirror episode, where Josh Lee Kwai starts to talk openly about his feelings now and how they've changed, and the professor, who has been his friend for 10 years, talks to him, trying to get him to open up a little bit. The thing that I wanted to analyze, being a licensed clinical mental health counselor in the state of North Carolina, having worked in the mental health field for many, many, many years, is one of the things that gets brought up is that anger doesn't do any good. And this gets brought up more from Josh Lee Kwai, who acknowledges that he was angry in those moments as the camera went on when he made those victim blaming statements. But now, in hindsight, looking back, he wants to, and I am assuming here, because of the content of the video, I do not know him or the professor, nor have I ever talked to them, but I'm just analyzing. It sounds like he would like to, based on statements, particularly towards the end of this video when you watch, bury the anger, sees no purpose in the anger. And I think the professor rightly corrects him a little bit on that in the middle of the video at some point, saying that, okay, well, anger can inform you before you put that video out as a content creator. It can tell you something. And what I would like to look at this at, and why I would like to look at this, is because I practice the type of therapy called internal family systems. It's called IFS for short. It was created by Dr. Richard Schwartz. It views, to just trim it down to the sort of the elevator pitch version, that we all have sort of a multiplicity of voices, thoughts, thought patterns, histories within us that have almost a voice, not as in like we're multiple personalities, but very much along the lines of sort of the movie Inside Out from Pixar, except that there is particularly like a central driver, a central self, quote unquote, a version of you that at your best state is curious and calm and compassionate and caring, that these are your best moments in life and that you can tap into that self. But around it are all these other voices and thoughts and histories in particular, because a lot of these voices and thought patterns, which form sort of neural pathways in the brain, like neural pathways that respond to stimuli or triggers or trauma in certain ways, they form when we're really young. So I say histories meaningfully, as in sometimes our history does indeed define who we are, at least for a short while until we take time to look at it. Now, one of the keys to IFS and doing therapy work with it is that there are no bad parts. So, oftentimes in cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, um, we might get the view that that therapy kind of wants to excise these sort of like irrelevant or um, non helpful thought patterns. But in IFS, we want to listen to and be informed by some of these thoughts, these patterns, these angers or frustrations or sadnesses or grief, but we don't want to be ruled by them. We don't want them taking the wheel like a character in Inside Out might do at the control panel inside of the girl's brain. We don't want the character to just take the car and drive us off the side of the cliff, which can happen when we feel really upset, really triggered. Um, but the thing is, by excising or removing or pretending that it doesn't exist or it's not helpful, that negative pattern, that negative thought, it's always like a lump under the rug. It's there and it will come out again in moments when we feel very triggered. Um, so Josh went into some of the things that triggered him in this video. He talked about feeling an ownership of the format of Commander, of which logically, yes, we don't have ownership of Commander. I don't know if anybody really does. But on an emotional level, we can all understand, I hope, that sometimes those feelings do come up. And he brings this up in comparison with fandom, which he probably is very familiar with, living out in California and LA. You have Star Wars and Marvel and all these things that everyone feels ownership over to a degree. And so, therefore, if the thing is changed or made different into a thing that we don't like, there's a natural sort of upset of like, oh, you took this thing that I love and you turned it into something else. But so he takes ownership of that, is like maybe that was one of the things he was feeling and he doesn't love that feeling either, or acknowledging that he has that feeling. I get the impression overall, before we jump in, that he is not as comfortable with sort of self exploration and sharing feelings. That could be because he's on camera. I only get that impression because Prof seems to be the one that kind of prods him to do these more open videos. There was one that happened maybe a couple months ago where they revealed the behind the scenes of the command zone. And Josh, for whatever lived experience or reason, seems to be willing to do that, maybe because Prof and him are such good friends and he recognizes that there's some value in being open. But also, I think there's a hesitancy in him as compared with the professor, who, Brian, I don't know him, but he seems like he kind of wears his heart on his sleeve a lot. So there's a guardedness to Josh. And I think this video tries to start cracking some of that open in the interest of being open with the community that supports the command zone and supports the professor, or maybe the community that's like upset with him. Um, So in internal family systems, we talk about there are no bad parts. And that's because when we bury the bad parts and we pretend they're bad and when we just look at them as bad, we're also looking at a thing that's inside of us and just being like, I am bad. There's a transference there between, we're not just talking about that one part of us that's angry. We're really often talking about like, I'm a bad person because I did a bad thing. And that honestly precludes you from being able to heal in a lot of ways, or to change, or to make different choices. Um, and it also prevents us from understanding why that bad part happened, why that bad part took over. Um, and the way I say in internal family systems when I'm working with folks is that anger is righteous. I, I challenge you to think of a time in your life, whether or not logically it made a lot of sense, but challenge you to find a part in your life, a time in your life when you felt anger and it wasn't because you witnessed some sort of injustice or what you thought was an injustice, either to yourself, your pet, your friend, worldwide, right? Anger doesn't tend to breed in neutral grounds. Anger tends to arise when there is injustice, and it's often a mode that lets us take action on that injustice. And sometimes we take action before we know all of the facts because we become so angry that we stop kind of operating in a mode where we're exploratory or curious or compassionate for others, and we just want to correct the injustice. And I think when Josh filmed the previous video of him and Jimmy and Rachel talking, um, he hinted at something there which kind of inspired me to make this video that he does not talk about here with Brian. But I think in this video, my concern is for Josh that I think he should kind of look a little deeper, maybe dig deeper with a therapist if he has one right now, or find a therapist who's willing to go there with him. Because in the hindsight window and the clear-headedness of this particular episode versus where he was heated in the moment, we got to see that he was actually talking about out loud a fear of a sort of corporate control or entity taking control of Commander. He talks about his time at these big studios, and he's seen, quote unquote, and he brings this up in the video with him and Jimmy and Rachel, about how these big corporations often make decisions that are sort of disconnected from what maybe the fandom or population at large might want or might be beneficial. And I think that there's a piece of Josh, or a part of Josh, that is afraid of that because he worked in those environments. He mentioned several in the video, and I can't remember what they are off the top of my head, but I think Disney was one. So you can't get any bigger as far as a corporation than Disney, really. And he broke free of that. If we look at Josh's history, the Command Zone is an entrepreneurial enterprise where he gets to do this thing that he loves, took this podcast all the way to the place where it's at now, with 741,000 subscribers there on the screen. And I think that there's probably lived experience that happened at Disney or wherever the other studios were that kind of rubbed him wrong. When we talk about being triggered and moments that trigger us, it is often because we are made afraid. Either it's fear of like literal physical harm, but it could be also fear of my livelihood, fear of this thing that I love being taken and changed or morphed. And so he talks about, he had this piece of him that was a little immature that kind of wanted control or to be consulted almost. He calls it a petulant child in this particular video, part of himself that wants that control, like you should consult me on before you give away control of the format to Wizards of the Coast / Hasbro. And that's kind of what parts work is, right? If you talk about this voice, this thought in his own head that as like a petulant child, the parts in ourselves that become afraid, become triggered, are often formed during traumatic moments and often early in life. So the only way to kind of work with those parts and heal them is to access them with the help of a therapist in a safe environment and hear them out and care for them, because those parts only came up, those thought patterns only formed, those neural pathways only branched out in our mind because of a response to anxiety or fear or shame or guilt. And it would be useful to unwrap those things, I think, in counseling sessions for him in the future. So I just wanted to highlight this because if any of you out there are working through your own anger, or you have moments where you feel triggered, where you feel hurt and you almost recognize it as somebody else taking the wheel, or that is not who I am is a phrase that comes out of your mouth, recognize that we are a multiplicity. And so I wanted to share just a little bit. So parts can be thoughts, inner voices, feelings, physical symptoms almost. When I became sick to my stomach because I was so nervous, or anxious about this thought I had that kept recurring. It can be images. We see things that are bad or negative. We imagine the worst case, or we just imagine past traumas that have happened. Um, a felt sense, almost like a sense of dread when we walk into a room. We walk on eggshells is a thing that I often hear in counseling. When you have folks in abusive relationships or around people who are very angry or abusive sometimes, um, words, can be parts, like certain words that or sensations that trigger us, sounds. Another one that's not on here, but smells. My house burned down when I was in third grade. Full disclosure. Honestly, and later on, like 20 years old or whatever, I'm working for a newspaper at like a college, and I go to a staff member's house who burns down to take photos to start writing an article about, hey, can we help this family out? And the smell, it came right back to me. Whatever it is about that chemically sort of smell of like wood and electrical wires and plastic and all this other stuff melded together, it just felt like I was in third grade all over again. And it's sort of this involuntary seizing of the wheel briefly. Now, it didn't bring back fear or terror, but it did bring back a deep sadness, right? A sadness I hadn't felt in many, many, many moons. So these are all kind of things that can be parts of ourselves that we shouldn't just ignore, because they're just kind of warning signals or reminders that there's still hurt inside of there. And we can put it to the side if we need to, because we're doing our jobs and whatever, but we need to kind of pay attention and think, oh, I could look into that later with the help of somebody else who's professional at doing this. So the last thing I wanted to share just about internal family systems, and if you're interested and you're still watching, thanks, I appreciate it, that there is this core self, and we feel it sometimes. I've felt it in my own life, like when I was sitting on the side of the Grand Canyon. The core self, as you would imagine, is almost like this Buddhist monk figure, maybe, who just doesn't seem phased, doesn't have wants or needs in that moment, feels content, feels curious about the world around them. Um, it's just taking space and just kind of happy with being alive in the present moment, rather than thinking about, oh, I got this report to do, or oh, I can't believe what my boss is doing, like that my job's going to totally change, or I can't believe what magic is going through right now as I scroll through Twitter and I'm just constantly distracted from my own internal sense of self. So in IFS, there are different types of patterns, thought patterns that sort of take over in our lives. And I'll give some examples maybe of these. So let's skip the exiles for now, because that's the very complicated one. But in short, it's like the very hurt, small, childlike parts of ourselves that were often defenseless in moments. And in response to those parts not having any power to change a situation, we came up with these other modes of action or these other thought patterns that took over. Those things can be managers. So managers are often like the inner critic. Inner critic might say, oh, well, you're not doing this good enough, so as soon as your grades are bad, your parents are going to get mad. Now, we say no bad parts because the inner critic is trying to have you avoid your parents getting mad, but it's doing so by criticizing you, by making you think that you're less than or you're not giving enough effort. And it's trying to do that sort of negative prodding that we often do when we're young about, like, I should do this better. Angry protector. So this is something that maybe Josh Lee Kwai felt. It's like, I'm angry that the commander format's going away from the way that I knew, and now is going into Wizard's control, perhaps because I had this deep-rooted exile in me that kind of fears the powerlessness of corporate control. And he felt maybe that in a community setting, and I'm pontificating here, so if that's not correct, or if Josh Lee Kwai watches this for some reason, please correct me. I always say this in sessions too. I sometimes I volley something out, And if it's not correct for the person, I want them to throw it back, because eventually through this process we'll come to the truth about what's going on for the human being that's sitting there with me. And the truth can be very powerful and helpful for them. But angry protectors come out when there's a sense of injustice, as we talked about before. The workaholic, now this is the one that sort of dissociates, right? This is the one that has cleaned the house, maybe one room in the house 13 times already. I'm exaggerating, but vacuums over and over again, cleans all the dishes, instead of paying attention to that there's sort of sadness or emotional distress underneath that action. This is a manager or a protector, as we sometimes call them, that comes out and is like, don't worry, we don't have to feel that right now. What we're going to do is we're going to bury ourselves in our work. And we're just going to keep doing that until whatever this nasty thing is goes away. And this is very common for a lot of folks. Now, firefighters are often these sort of managers, but they're sort of like negative. I know inner critic's not exactly the most logically positive one, but it has like a positive end to it. So when we talk about, I hate the word drug abuser, so we'll just skip over that. Like, I think more like drug user. I don't know. The idea of abuse just rubs me wrong. We'll talk about that in another video maybe. But someone who uses drugs, someone who uses substances to try and escape from, to get away from pain, trauma, whatever, that's another part that can take over. Does that ultimately solve the problem? Is that logically going to solve a problem? No, not always. But this may be a pattern that is repeated ad nauseum for many, many years in this person's life, to the point where it doesn't even make sense to try other things. So, anyways, I think it's important that we look at our own parts. What comes up when we feel triggered, when we feel stressed? Do we sometimes feel like somebody's taking the wheel? When in actuality, it's just us, but it's a collection of parts inside of us. It's important to be able to make distance, to say, like, I'm not always the angry part, but sometimes that part does come up. And ultimately, what we want is for the true self, the compassionate, calm, collected, curious, content self. And they're all C words, I get it. It's because that's part of the model. But we want that self to be able to dictate the terms and say, like, I call upon my angry part now, because my angry part can get stuff done. My angry part can change things for the better. It can fight for people who feel injustice. I want my workaholic part to come online, because I have a project that's due tomorrow, and I need its ability to organize and push through stress and trauma right now, and I need it to come online, because without it, it's going to be really tough for my other parts, which are not as well equipped, to get the job done. So ultimately, there's no bad parts. And in terms of Josh Lee Kwai, I hope that he learns to better listen to his anger and use it to inform future decisions, rather than letting anger steer the wheel or take the wheel in those moments. And that he's able to look at that in perhaps therapy, in a place where with a person he trusts, to talk about it openly. And I do think there's some truth to the initial frustrations he shared about corporate control of stuff. I share that same hesitation and fear myself sometimes. Do we really trust companies that are just in things for the money, to do their best? I would say I don't. I don't know about you. Do I trust Gavin Verhey? Yeah. I mean, I think he again wears his heart on his sleeve oftentimes, and is really deeply caring about the format, and a smart guy. I just don't believe that he's going to be able to make all of the decisions. I think he'll have input, but corporate control is a scary thing for me. So there's a part of me that grieves for the rules committee no longer being controlled by the community, or not the rules committee no longer controlling Commander, I guess, in terms of bannings and stuff. And I think that there is sort of an interest in Wizards to make money, so that does kind of go at odds with their ability to police or ban cards that are obnoxious, like Jeweled Lotus, in my opinion. So anyways, those are my thoughts. I hope that you um, took something away from it. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the comments. And yeah, thanks for watching.